Now let's revisit who's who in your survey. So who's who? The who of a survey can refer to different groups, and how ambiguous that is can tell you a lot about how successful you'll be. So to start, think about the population of interest. So for example, if you're interested in an election, you're interested in the people who will be voting in the election. Now, I can tell you that many people don't know that population of exactly who will be voting in our upcoming elections. So it's kind of impractical to try to study the voters right now. Now you have to specify a sampling frame. So since we don't exactly know who the voters are, how could we figure that out? Well, it's not exactly the group I really want to know about, but this will help me if I get registered voters, because in theory, you need to be registered to vote. But it also limits what my survey can find out. So maybe there are people who can register up to a certain time frame, and if my list doesn't include the more recent people registering, then that might influence it. Then there's your target sample. These are the people whom you want to get measured responses from. So you're going to ask them. You're sending them the survey, or you're trying to get a hold of them. You're not going to get everybody to respond to your survey, and those would be your non-respondents. And then finally, your sample. You started with trying to get likely voters, then you went to the sample frame of registered voters, and then you picked your actual voters, right? Or hopefully your actual registered voters, and you got them, and you're like, okay, finally someone answered my question. That is your sample, that group of people who answered your survey. Unfortunately, they may or may not be representative of the sampling frame, or the population, as we saw in that Landon versus Roosevelt example. So at each step, the group we can study can be constrained further, so we can tighten it up. And who keeps changing, and each constraint we put on there can put biases on it. So you should always figure out how well each group matches the group you're really trying to understand. One of the main benefits of simple random sampling is that since you're just doing a random and you know who everyone in the who population is, so I can do a simple random sample of students at Cedar Ridge because I have a complete list of students at Cedar Ridge. But I can't do it of people who will be voting in the election because I don't actually have that. So anyways, so the who in a simple random sample is a population of interest from which we've drawn a representative sample, and it's not always true for others. Okay, so one more thing that can go wrong, and I've kind of covered most of these that can go wrong. They're in your book, but when I talked about biases, response bias, non-response bias, that was at the beginning of the lesson. One of the other ways is sampling from a bad sampling frame. So if we do a simple random sample from an incomplete sampling frame, then we've left people out. So we're dealing with undercoverage. Okay, so a lot of the bad survey designs suffer from that. So if I only do people who have phones at the home, I'm going to be leaving out a lot of cell phones. Okay, so that's always a potential source of bias. And finally, some things to think about for bias. Look for bias in any survey you encounter, and if you get a bias sample, there's no way you can use it. Get a new one. Spend your time and resources reducing bias before you do your sample, and if possible, pre-test your survey. And always report your sampling methods in detail. On the AP test, they want to know how you're getting your sample.